Hi everyone, I'm Hugo, partner at Pinsent Masons,
And I'm Luke McKinney, Director of Consulting at Nile.
and we're here to talk about the siloed faithful model in the third installment of this series about innovation functions and how we're seeing it done in our experience. So Luke, do you want to give a bit more detail about the siloed faithful model?
Yes, I will explain this pun. So this is probably the most easy to set up, or not necessarily the most easy to set up, but the most common one that we see within organizations as a first attempt. Simple version of it is where you create a traditional organization kind of silo, but directed towards innovation. So you just have a digital innovation area, which is centralized, but separate to other organizational silos or business function. This is an interesting one because I think it's the one that just occurs to most executives when setting up an organization. It's like, oh, well, we just need a business area that does this. However, it has some kind of pros and cons, as they all do. So I'll start with the pros. It works well if the organization already has kind of a strong culture of innovation. And by that, I mean are willing to change things up and move in organizations. And again, if you're working in a highly regulated industry, you tend to be a little bit more risk averse by nature, which is fine and important. But it does make this model potentially a little bit more, ironically, risky as a result of it. It also works if there's kind of a clear strategy at a kind of a organizational level that can help guide innovation and digital pipelines across that team, but also other business areas as required. What this really kind of comes down to is a defined rules of engagement between this business area and other business areas with their own priorities. The biggest challenges that we see probably revolve around that lack of clarity around priority. And as a result, you just end up in infinite loops of waiting for other teams to weigh in. So probably the biggest strength or the biggest positive around this is because it is within the business, unlike the speedboat model that we've previously talked about. It works better if you're trying to operationalize solutions or initiatives at scale within an enterprise or within kind of an existing customer base. So that is probably the key benefit of it. I won't go into the drawbacks yet until we've had a chance to discuss that. As with all of these, it's not a bad model, but within regulated industry, it does, in our experience, definitely prove a little bit more challenging.
Yeah, and I see this definitely being used as an innovation model in the legal sector. I think if law firms are trying to step up from the speedboat model of some flavor, then they'll either go for the siloed faithful model or, which we'll cover in the next installment, the embedded expert model. And the siloed faithful model, as you were saying, Luke, tends to be characterized by a centralized team that's not affiliated to any particular practice group. So law firms tend to organize themselves around practice groups which serve particular sort of work types or problem types that clients have. So it acts as a horizontal service line, I guess, ideally, that serves across the various practice group verticals, so finance, litigation, and so on. And you can see this model, I think, quite clearly in a number of law firms if you're looking for it, about how they talk about themselves as a distinct innovation in function in their business, tasked with coming up with creative solutions and products. Now, there are some important, I think, advantages to this because, as opposed to the speedboat model, these will tend to be larger in terms of headcount, and they'll tend to be more integrated into the business. So there's more corporate heft, if you want to put it that way, about how this business can pursue its agenda, like having, and I know this sounds pretty dry, but a centralized collective budget that might allow for a bigger ticket to marketing or research, a more coordinated voice within the business that's seen as very much part of and integrated with the business, and not other. Things like resource, it might have a wider resource base, allowing it the ability to allocate resources across those verticals where it's seeing highest demand or the best fit for the model. And that allows more efficiency about where it's investing its time and resources. And if it's a single larger team, they might be able to operate across more internal initiatives and more solution developments, rather than, for example, the speedboat model, where you might find they become really expert in a particular service line or a particular product, but law firms are selling a multitude of different types of activity and work types and legal advice to clients. And so therefore that speedboat model will sometimes neglect whole parts of the business because they're not specializing in what that part of the business needs. So you get all the traditional benefits of being larger, but there are definitely some downsides to this model as well. I'll sort of talk about one that we come across quite a lot, and it's amazing how sometimes this isn't taken into account enough. But in a business like a law firm, internal competition can be entirely toxic to collaboration and changing the way things are done. It can be a real poison pill for innovation propositions or models, which by definition have radical collaboration as their prerequisite for success. We mentioned in an earlier series that the people who are closest to the problems that need to be solved and the clients and what they expect are typically the partners in the law firm who work with them all the time. And you need to be working very closely with them in order to change effectively the way things are done and to give clients what they need. But by setting up a large, centralized, and almost necessarily expensive team, that often comes with its own financial budgets and targets, which may give the sense that that centralized team is actually competing for work in a way that is sort of zero-sum game. You're kind of shuffling revenue from one part of the business to another. And that can really put people off collaborating if the sense is that that business line is out to self-serve and justify its own existence rather than being selflessly collaborative. And I sort of have gone through that quite ponderously because it is so important to try to, as a factor to take into account.
And again, this kind of comes back to that point about very clear strategy around that. And like, if all business areas are not pushing in the same direction, this suddenly like starts to like fall apart. And related to, but I think like a slightly different but related observation I've noticed working within organizations such as law firms, where the main performance metric is often around billable hours. So this is interesting in a number of reasons. One, because I have noticed within those organizations that there tends to be a slightly more competitive culture around certain aspects of that and how resources are distributed. I feel that's an uninflammatory way to say that. Yes. But also it can be a little bit stifling to innovation. So suddenly there's a technology that can make your process 10 times faster, but you get to bill for that time. So why would you take the time out of the process for the benefit of your client if you're going to lose revenue? Like, the business case doesn't work out. And again, this is where I kind of talk about kind of collaboration is key, because again, you can't just innovate with the technology and then not adjust your pricing model accordingly. But then suddenly those billable hours are coming out of one part of the organization and those fees are going into another part of an organization. And it kind of misses out. I can actually tell a story.
Well, let's have the story, because I was going to violently agree with you, Luke. Let's have the story, and I can do that after.
So this was within an organization that essentially had two silos, one for their digital channels and one for their servicing telephony channels. But their metrics were so out of whack that they had a great opportunity to collaborate with one another, but just essentially missed it. So the servicing part of the business had a lot of challenges with people just calling up with really mundane tasks. Was taking a lot of people on the phone time to resolve them. All of these tasks that were kind of coming in time and time again would have just been really perfectly solved by a digital channel. So, it doesn't require someone to pick up the phone each time. You could resolve it with a relatively simple UX journey. However, the digital team wasn't incentivized to solve servicing requests. They were incentivized to increase digital sales. So all of their time, effort, and resource essentially was going into improving their sales journeys and improving their product journeys. So they could essentially point to the revenue that they were creating through sales. This was just a kind of classic mismatch between the KPIs of that. So rather than try to remove, they could have removed a lot more cost by digitizing their servicing channels than they ever would have needed through digital sales. But the strategy was off. The alignment between the two silos was off. And as a result, it took quite a bit of back and forth before it got escalated to someone who was more senior than both silo heads. And kind of a solution was kind of worked out. But we see those types of mismatches time and time again where, people are motivated by good things, but if your area's KPIs are just slightly out of whack with another area's KPIs, then suddenly from an overarching enterprise perspective, you're starting to lose money.
Yeah.
So, and again, that kind of comes, I do see it a lot with billable organizations, for want of a better word, as well.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's a sort of slightly tired thing, isn't it? But you get what you measure. And all firms are fantastic at measuring billable hours because that's been the model. But I think there are less probably adept as an industry about measuring the impact of a solution on a matter. And often that's because you're lacking control for that. A lot of projects are unique. So you do it one way, you do it another way. The benefits can be a little speculative. It's not entirely scientific to judge the benefits, but often it will be clear that innovation has delivered it in a way that couldn't have been done previously, and that must then have inherent benefits from, say, just throwing loads of people at it. But yeah, you get what you measure. And so if you set these functions up and you don't have an eye on what your incentive and KPI structure will do to how people behave, then you may be setting it up for tension in the way that those functions need to be working together that can frustrate the effort. So I know it sounds like sort of like dry corporate governance stuff, but why are we talking about this? It's innovation, it's sexy technology. How are we going to change the world? But actually, it's stuff like this can really hamper the benefits or hamper the efforts that we're trying to do, but harness by being more interested in using that technology. So it's really important.
Yeah. I do feel really strongly about this. I've always been slightly averse to kind of individual targets because they can never kind of really reflect like the organization. Like, I think top line targets are great, but I think like when you start to get in this idea of kind of breaking it down by area starts to instantly become muddy very, very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as an interesting example of when the team that I lead was starting out, we were keen to tell the stories of how we were making differences in the way that masses were developed and delivered for clients. But the metrics that were gathered by the firm weren't telling all of that story. So we came up with other different ways of collecting that data that are particular to us. They're not perfect, but they're better than what we had if we were just to rely on what the firm was already doing. So that's an interesting example of actually, if what's being collected doesn't tell the story, well, what can you do to gather that information that allows you to bring out what benefit it is that you're bringing to the business and to the clients. Another sort of area where the central function, I think, gives you different outcomes to the model we'll cover in the next installment, the embedded experts, is that, again, central functions could be seen as in a way, reiterating that divide between you've got your BAU subject matter expert lawyers delivering their legal advice, and then you've got a central innovation function that does innovation. And those worlds may not necessarily mix. Ultimately, at this level, what I've seen is that what really makes the difference is personal relationships and trust, because you're not going to deliver a bet the farm project using technology solutions and capabilities that require a completely different way of working in terms of planning, timeline, and cost, unless you have absolute confidence that that is going to work, and that you can recommend it to the client that you're pitching the work for. And if you have, again, a central team that doesn't necessarily have all those connections into the parts of the business where the work's coming from, again, you may end up doing less solution style work where you're working with delivery teams to deliver a particular project in a different way. And you may end up more doing internal improvement activity. And I've seen that in practice where central functions, for example, have developed chatbots or brought in enterprise technology to help the business kind of run a bit better behind the scenes. Question whether that is making a step change in the way that clients experience the service that's being delivered, truly tech-led or tech-enhanced delivery of legal services. That's another feature of the sort of central model that I've seen. And again, you may end up with, depending on how embedded that central team is across the various verticals of the business, you may end up with a positive feedback loop where parts of the business that are, let's say, neglected continue to be neglected because you're not building those relationships, and parts of the business where that central team is more active for whatever reason continue to deliver or receive a sort of a more fulsome service from that central team. Yeah. And so the central team, whilst notionally covering more of the business, could fall into the same trap as the speedboat model, because people will tend to work more with the people that they work more with, and you end up in a positive feedback loop.
And again, this is why, like, kind of that, and again, organizational culture at an enterprise level is very, very difficult. So you can get it consistent in some places, but there's always going to be inconsistency in some other places. And again, if there isn't that alignment, both from a relationship ways of working, how we get on, how we kind of ask requests from one another, how we trust one another is kind of like a big one of it, because again, we talk a lot about kind of the messy middle bit of innovation, because there is this bit where you're like sense making and testing and things aren't working. And, we've all met execs who just want the answer there and now. So you kind of need to manage that quite clearly. But again, like this is the thing, like if you want to do something that is truly different or hasn't existed, like to be the first to do something, that doesn't happen if it's being done side of desk, or like you need the headspace to think, but also to think differently. And that to be honest is probably one of the main observations that I've had with the legal industry. It's like no one can accuse you of not being industrious as an industry, but more often than not, when I see like problems getting solved, it's more we'll throw 5 more people at it and they'll work until 6 a.m. and then suddenly that headspace to think differently gets chipped away quite quickly. So again, that is kind of one of the challenges of having BAU activities in general, but also culturally. If your culture is to work harder, then actually the thinking differently part disappears quite quickly.
Absolutely, and I think that is something that the legal industry would readily accept is a huge feature of innovation and doing things differently. It will come typically second to client delivery, the way we've done it before, because that requires actually putting the pens down on what you'll be measured and rewarded for to do something that might not work. And typically, legal industry practitioners are not that comfortable with experimentation for reasons that are entirely understood.
Yeah, it can. Again, it's I would describe it as any regulated industry. Like if your business is primarily, if your purpose for being is to manage risk, suddenly innovation becomes very risky.
Indeed.
And again, but that's also kind of the beauty of this. There's so much opportunity. Like anything which is like, high risk tolerance is pretty much being done. So, like if you're focusing on I could tell you how to digitize an e-commerce journey because Amazon has pretty much tested out everything that works there and does it because, that's their risk appetite. You tell me how to like rewrite the content and copywriting for a pensions journey. No one's really cracked that yet because the industry is so risk averse that it's not suited for digitization yet. So like, there's pros and cons to it of like, there's a lot of opportunity still on tap within these industries.
Yeah. And so one of the last sort of drawbacks of the model, and again, it comes down to governance and how institutions tend to organize themselves, is that a central team will tend to try and have one vision and a number of objectives that are aimed at the business. And of course, a law firm is, you can see it as a cluster of lots of little businesses within a larger one. So across practice groups, across subject matter expertise, across clients. And having a central team with one vision, one set of objectives, and maybe expertise that lean in a particular direction is unlikely, I think, to serve all parts of the business equally well or have a vision that suits each part of the business equally well. So you may end up with a one-size-fits-all approach, which may not actually fit all the characteristics and work types of particular practitioners or practice groups or teams within the law firm. And then again, you'll start to see that sort of positive feedback cycle of doing more work with parts of the business which are more aligned with your vision and objectives, and starting to see cold spots developing in parts of the firm where actually what they need isn't being delivered by the central team because that's not aligned with the vision and objectives of that team.
Yeah, and that is honestly, that's such a great sum up. I think the one thing that I have noticed, having done this for quite some time as well, is then the time aspect of how to. So a bit of distance. I can almost tell you the preference for a centralized versus a decentralized innovation function, depending on the general performance of the economy. I would love to actually run this and see what the data says. But we tend to find organizations move to or move back to a centralized kind of siloed faithful model when the focus of the business becomes much more around cost saving. So it consolidates spend, it keeps it in the place, but as far as an outcome perspective goes, as far as delivering things that are creating value, it's probably a little bit more challenging because you get one-stop solutions that maybe serve one business area's needs, but not quite another. So they don't fully extract the value from it. Meanwhile, when the focus is kind of times are better and the focus is much more on growth, suddenly we move on to a more decentralized kind of, you get the skills that you need within your area and do what you need to do to be profitable, which we will discuss in more detail in our next conversation, just to leave that little cliffhanger ending.
Yeah, nice teaser.
Yeah. We're getting good at this.
Thanks everyone for joining again this installment of the series. And Luke and I will see or be on the screen in front of you for the next installment where we talk about the embedded expert model. So again, thanks very much for joining.